Welcome back, golf fans. Was waiting to say that for a few weeks now. Stoked to be back to some PGA Tour golf. This week, we've got the Fortinet Championship and a course breakdown to go ahead and bring to you guys right now. Gonna go through everything you need to know about Silverado, the North Course, out there in Napa Valley, and make sure you're ready to go out there, fire on a few outrights, have all the research you need to get your DFS process started, and hopefully make this first event of the season one to remember. And I know the whole season is out of whack because the fall isn't counting towards the FedEx Cup, but we've still got GPPs to take down, some outrights to hit. So from our end, a fandom side, right, not much has changed over the next few months. So stoked for it. We've got a golf course that we see year in and year out, a lot of research to bring to you guys. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get this thing started. So the North Course at Silverado Resort is a shorter track. It's a par 72 that only measures 7,123 yards. So you see a lot of the older players, people that maybe aren't as explosive off the tee, win here a lot of times. But also players like Cam Champ, even a Max Homa that won last year that are super stout off the tee, also get the job done. So if we're looking at a player archetype, anytime we get a shorter kind of track, it opens up the field a little bit when it comes to potential winners, right? The shorter hitters, more of the wedge specialist, can definitely get the job done. And if you're a bomber, right, like a Cam Champ or a Max Homa, well, you can still take advantage of that skill set too. So I like the golf course setup, especially for the first event of the year. And it's really going to open up our options, both when it comes to those outrights and for some of our DFS picks. A few other things to note about this track is the agronomy, a little bit different than pretty much every other event on tour. It's over there in Napa Valley, so you'd expect a lot of that West Coast agronomy, but rather than just pure POA out there, you have a few interesting mixes. And just to give you an idea, the greens are POA / bent. That's not all that much different, although, most of the bent POA mixes on tour are dominated by a bent grass surface. Out here in Napa Valley, it's actually the POA grass that's dominant. So it's a similar type of hybrid to what we have for a lot of other golf tournaments on tour, but a little bit different, right? With the POA being the dominant surface. You also have bluegrass rough over here on the West Coast, which is much more typical of what we get in the Midwest or even the Northeast of the United States. And then your approaches are a POA / ryegrass mix. So if you're looking at agronomy and trying to compare it to other courses on the PGA Tour, you're going to have a really tough time. This is a unique scenario. These greens, it's really the only time that we see that POA / bent grass sided towards the POA side. And also the bluegrass rough out west is not something you see all that often. So it's a unique track. It's shorter. Some of the older guys like Stewie Sink have had success here. Brendan Steele, right, who's not known as that explosive off the tee player, especially at his old age, got the job done here. So we're going to take a look at a lot of the different players in the field, but the one real similarity, as you'll see when we go hole by hole and we talk about our key stats, is that you have to be good with the wedges, right? 100 to 125 yards, you're looking about twice the usage at this course compared to others on tour. And then 100 to 125 yard range, the same kind of thing, utilized a lot more than your average tour pro. If you're one of the shorter hitters in the field, that 125 to 150 yard range is also utilized more than most. But if you're a bomber, right, it's more so the 75 to 100 and then 100 to 125 yard range. So if you're looking at the buckets, the shorter hitters, the guys that can control their spin from 100 yards and in, are some of the players that have won this event. So just to give you an idea, right? Max Homa, decent wedge player, but Stuart Sink, excellent wedge player. Cameron Champ, maybe not so much, but the further back you go, Kevin Tway, decent wedge player. Brendan Steele, excellent iron player, and especially with some of the wedges. Same thing with Emiliano Grillo. Sungyoon Bae, same thing. Jimmy Walker, Jonas Blixt. The further back that you go, it's a lot of shorter hitters, guys that aren't Rory McIlroy's. They're not really like a Cameron Champ. He was kind of one of the outliers there in 2020, but a lot of shorter hitters that get the job done. So that's worth noting. Scoring average last year was 0.48 under par. In 2022, so 2 seasons ago, it was 0.95 under par. In 2021, it was 1.79 under. And then in 2020, it was 0.76 under par. So under par every single year there. In fact, the hardest scoring average was there just last season, right? 0.48 under par. You also had a lower driving accuracy than what you're used to seeing at lower than 50%. It was 46.8% last year, which is much lower than some of the other years. And then your green and regulation percentage was 66.4%, which is still higher than your average on tour, right? Being such a short course, having so many wedges in hand, but still lower than what you mostly see at Silverado. So just to give you an idea, that driving average was 47% in 2022. So just marginally higher. In 2021, it was 51, nearly 52%. So it was significantly higher than what you saw the last 2 years. You take a look at the green and regulation average, it goes from like 66% up to 71, 72% there in 2021. 2020 it was back to about 65, 66%. So that was pretty much on par with what we saw last year. But in 2019, you had about nearly 69% average for greens regulation, and in 2017, nearly a 67%. So the green regulation average is typically pretty consistent from year to year, but the fairways can play drastically different, right, based on some of the weather coming in. Few weather notes: it has not rained in Napa this month. There has been zero precipitation in Silverado Resort. So if you're looking for a firm and fast type of golf course, we might be getting that this time around. So the reason why I mentioned this now is the fairways, right, that can kind of firm up there, I'd expect to be a little bit firmer this time, right? So the 45% average that you see at this course from year to year might happen this time around. The greens, I'd expect to be a little bit firmer this time with the lack of rain that they've gotten, but they'll still be watering the course. They don't want these greens to die, right? It's going to be played for resort play 11 out of the 12 months of the year, so they want to make sure that they're in good shape. So I don't expect the greens to really firm up all that much, right? Even in the harder years like you saw last year, it played to a 66% green regulation. Back in 2018 when it played kind of difficult, right, only 0.24 under par, it still played to a 66.8% green regulation rate. So this course, the greens never really get out of hand when it comes to the firmness, but the fairways can start to shade in that direction. The rough out there is a bluegrass rough. You have a little bit of ryegrass mixed in too. It is 2.5 inches. Not all that penal. Last year only played to a 0.2 stroke penalty every time that you missed a fairway. Back in 2022, it was pretty similar. It was 0.31 shots per missed fairway. So I guess depending on how lush the rough is going to be, right? I think the lack of rain is probably going to mean that the rough isn't as lush as it might be for most years. You're probably going to see like the 0.2 shot missed fairway penalty as opposed to the 0.31 that you saw there in 2022. A few other notes. Your designers here, you have a Ben Harmon. He was original designer in 1955. You had renovations by RTJ in 1966. And lastly, you had Johnny Miller in 2011 come in and do a little bit of a touch-up on the course as well. There will be a few differences here in 2023, though. Not really with the course architecture, more so just from the setup. You have 10 holes that are in a completely different order than what you had there in 2018. So still the same holes, right? The same 18 holes in play, just in a completely different routing. So when we go hole by hole, it's going to be completely out of whack, but just know that there's going to be a lot of changes on that end. The course has been really dry of late, which again, I think is going to make the course maybe a little bit firmer than what we've seen for the past, but it had an extremely wet winter, which I don't really know how that's going to impact the golf course, but of late, it has definitely started to dry out a bit. All right, now to take this place hole by hole and get an idea of what these players are going to be facing. So again, the setup of these, the ordering is going to be completely different. I have no idea how it's going to be ordered this year, so I don't have any insight on that. We will go through the 18 holes though, as I believe they were played last year. So hole number 1 was 439. It's a ever so slight dogleg from left to right. Pretty straightforward drive. I mean, you can miss left in the rough and still have an angle to the green. A lot of that will depend on the pin location, of course. Right side, same kind of thing. It's a relatively large green complex. They usually play pretty soft out here in Napa, even on some of the drier years. And out of that 2.5 inch bluegrass, you're going to see players still hold greens in regulation, just maybe not get it as close, right, as players that can apply spin to the golf ball. So hole number 1 really gives you a taste of what you're going to see out here at Silverado. You got some tight fairways. That's why the fairway average is as low as it typically is. And you've got some greens that aren't massive, but they're also not like Pebble Beach small. So even out of the rough, you can usually hold them given the receptiveness. Hole 2 is 243, longer par 3. You can see this green complex is even larger than what you had for hole 1. So some of the, harder holes, some of the longer par 4s are going to have larger green complexes to account for the, it's mid irons, it's longer irons that you're hitting into these kind of greens as opposed to wedges for a lot of the shorter par 4s. Hole 3 is 427. It's also worth noting that we're slightly at elevation out here in Napa Valley, so the ball does travel a little bit farther than usual, which makes a 427-yard hole even shorter than the scorecard yardage. And if it's going to play firm out on the fairways, maybe not so much the greens, you're going to get even more roll out there too. So your bombers might only have to hit a driving iron off this sort of tee. I mean, your shorter players, your older guys might be hitting 3-wood here, which is going to help out a lot with hitting the fairways. So that's something worth noting, and also why a 427-yard hole is essentially like a 3-wood wedge for most players. Hole 4 is 413, even easier than hole number 3. Not much to be said here. I guess there's out of bounds left. That could be an issue, but it's me and you, right, that are worried about hitting at OB, not so much these tour pros. Hole 5 is 536. This is a reachable par 5, but I will say this tee shot is the hardest on property, and it's also way trickier than it looks from overhead. So from overhead, it looks like just a real narrow fairway. The issue is that we're coming in from like the bottom right over here, right? Like our angle off the tee is not straight up the fairway, like you'd assume, right? From this overhead view, it's over here from like over this tree on the right. So the problem is that almost everyone, not everyone, but almost everybody, right, blows through the left over here or hits the trees to the right and is really screwed, right? Is looking at a tough layup at that sort of position. But where a majority of people are going to go are over here in the trees, and you're left with one of two options. Take it over the road in OB and try and cut it back onto the flag, which a lot of times, like if you're going to go for the green, is like the only shot that you're going to have from over there in those trees, or you got to lay up and you're going to have like 150 yards in. You're going to see bogeys, doubles, triple bogeys here at number 5. But if you can hit the fairway, right, you can get over here to the marker, which is really an iron off the tee. If you were going to lay back to here, it'd be an iron off the tee. You're going to have about 250 yards in. Everyone in the field can reach that, right? And if you are really daring, right, you want to take a driver, be much more aggressive off the tee, you can try and take it further down here towards the right. It's just that hitting that tiny target, and it's a blind target too. You can't even see it down there. That's what makes this even more difficult. It's just really hard to accomplish. So hole 5 is probably my favorite hole in property. I'm interested to see if it'll actually be hole 5 this year, right? They might move it around. Hole 6 is 460. This will be a fun little hole. It's longer than some of the other par 4s, but still, it's like a 9-iron in at the very most. Hole 7 is 214, longer par 3. Once again, a massive green complex to accommodate for the longer shot. That's why this golf course plays easy, right? Like the harder holes have a lot of things going for them for players. Hole 8 is 359. This is potentially drivable for some of the longer players on tour. To get it up here to the front edge, it is 323. Given the fact that it's normally pretty firm out there, will be this week, at least based on the current weather forecast. And the fact that we're at elevation, you can definitely get there if you're like a Cam Champ. Hole 9 is a par 5. This is reachable in 2. It's much easier than hole number 5, even though it's slightly longer than what we had for the first par 5. It's reachable in 2 by everyone in the field. Massive green, not really awkwardly shaped whatsoever. You should be making a birdie at hole number 9. If you're starting on the back 9, you have a little bit more of a tough go, especially for your first few holes. Hole 10 is 462, so once again, one of the longer par 4s. But again, if a 460-yard par 4 is as hard as it's going to get out here, I mean, that shows you why it's such an easy golf course, especially when it's, decent weather out there. Hole 11 is 186. It's actually one of the shorter par 3s on property. A little bit of water in play, but it's one of the rare holes where you're going to see that. Hole 12 is 397, so it's a shorter par 3, not really drivable, unlike you saw at hole number 8, but a birdie opportunity for most of the field. Hole 13 is 418, a little pitch and putt par 4. Not much that needs to be said there. Hole 14 is the same thing. There's not much that needs to be said. You hit a 3-wood, maybe a driver. There's room out here at Silverado. As you guys can see, there are some trees to worry about, but it's not like a Travelers Championship, a Valspar Championship, where you have these shoots off the tee to worry about. It's much more wide open, as most places are out west, right? It's not that same type of like East Coast kind of trees that you get. Hole 15 is 192, shorter par 3. This one also has water in play, so for, I guess, right-hand pin locations can get a little tricky. Hole 16 is a reachable par 5, 575. Maybe not reachable for the shorter guys. Like, you've got to keep it in the fairway, right? If you're going to reach in two. But if you hit the short stuff, I'd have to imagine that most players can get it out there 250, and that's the front edge number. 17 is 372. This is another potentially drivable par four, I should say. It'd be a par three for the US Open, huh? With the way that they were setting those up this year. But yeah, out here to this spot, which is a little short of the green, is 323. Your elite tier players, given elevation, maybe a little bit of downwind action, can get it there. And with firm and fast fairways, you can get it up to that front edge. I could see a few players doing that. I mean, you might even get a few players that get into some of these bunkers. We'll have to see if anyone takes it on. And then finally, hole 18 is 580. It's another relatively long par 5, but it's easier than hole 5, right? The tee shot is much more straightforward, and much like you had there at 16, if you hit the fairway, everyone can reach, right? I know it's like 270 yards to the pin, to the center, but it's like 250 yards to the front, and with how much rollout you're going to get with firm fairways, you'll have guys that are at least getting up their pin high. So this is a straightforward course. It's not all that interesting when it comes to the architecture standpoint, but it's a full swing event, right? It's a beautiful part of the country. Players get to go out there, enjoy Napa a little bit, and we get to enjoy some golf. Now that we've seen it hole by hole, let's go through some of our key stats of the week that I'm using to identify my top plays. So first up, we've got shots gained approach, which is almost always going to be number one. But what's to focus on here are the wedges. You've got a lot of 75 to 100 yard shots, a lot of 100 to 125 yard shots, like I was talking about before. And that's why you've had some of the older, more experienced players that are really good from that range find success. So I think shots gained approach, whether it's the 175 to 200 yard range or just in general, is always going to be extremely predictive. But this week, if you want to look at some of the stats from last year from some of the shorter buckets, I think you might find a little bit of success there. It's how I was able to play Stuart Sink when he went out there and won this event, and also how I was able to play him when Brendan Steele went out there and was able to win this championship when it was the Safeway Open. So there's a lot of credence to that. A lot of people that end up top 5ing and top 10ing here are some of the better wedge players on all of the PGA Tour. Number 2, we've got birdie or better percentage. I'm going to also throw in opportunities gained. A lot of databases will have birdie or better percentage. Not all of them are going to have opportunities gained, but are both metrics of how many birdie looks you're giving yourself, right? Obviously, birdie or better percentage is also a measure of how many that you're cashing in, but opportunities gained is perhaps an even better way to go about it. You want players out here that are going to give themselves a look, right? Anytime you're at a relatively straightforward, easy golf course, you need players that are used to going low, right? That have a propensity for going out there, getting to like 15, 20 under par. And though it might be a little bit firmer this time around, you're still going to see something of like at least 15 under par win. Like it's not going to be super difficult unless the winds were to kick up out there. And you need players that can go out there and take advantage of those conditions, right? There are going to be a few bogeys, right? I have to say this course can get you at a few spots, but you're going to have to make birdies to make up for that. And then lastly, we've got shots gained putting on this bent/POA surface. This is really a POA/bent surface, which is very different than what we've had on tour, but I am willing to look at some of the other hybrids, right? So Rocket Mortgage Classic, John Deere Classic, some of the Midwestern golf tournaments have this bent POA mix, and though it's not going to be a perfect measure of the type of greens that we have at Silverado, I think it's close enough to look at. A lot of your top finishers, especially top 5, top 10 finishers at this event, have been skilled putters over the past few years, so I think that's worth looking at. Shots gained around the green, you can look at some of those stats here. Some of the better around the green players have found success at Silverado. And then lastly, some of your par 4 scoring. A lot of your separation here, right? The par 5s are gettable for pretty much everybody. A lot of your separation comes on those like 400 yard par 4s. So if you're going to look at par 4 scoring stats, maybe that 400 yard to 450 yard range is something to hunker down on just because of how many there are at this golf course. And there's even a few that are like 395, right? Like 397 that are just outside that range. They're going to play pretty much the same as those type of holes. And it's like 10 of the 18 holes fit that description, or maybe it's like 8 of the 18. I know it's like most of the holes fit that description out there, especially when it comes to the par 4s. Might be worth looking at as well. And lastly, we'll wrap up with our comp courses of the week. Few of the tracks around the PGA Tour that should play similar to what we see this week and might be worth looking at for some of your analysis. So first off, we got Detroit Golf Club. It's a bent POA course in terms of the greens, so not the perfect comp. Again, it's as close as we're going to get. And another easy, straightforward off the tee golf course, we're going to have an excess of wedges. There's a lot of skill set overlap. There's a lot of champion overlap between the two courses, and a lot of people that have top 5, top 10 at both golf courses. So there's just a lot of correlation. You look at data golf over the past few years, it's been one of the top correlated courses. So really checks almost every box that we're looking for. This was on our comp course list last year, so really not changing up all that much. It's another easy course, right? It's all about birdie better percentage. It's all about the wedges. It's about potentially keeping yourself in play off the tee. All similar things to what we have at Silverado. Next up, we've got TPC River Highlands, the home of the Travelers Championship. This was also on our comp course list last year. Not a huge agronomy similarity, right? You have the same type of greens, but completely different there up there in the Northeast. Looks a lot different, a lot more water in play there at the Travelers Championship. But for whatever reason, the crossover success, the top 5, top 10s between the two golf courses is eerily similar. So I think I'm just going to trust the data there, right? Look at some of the, different correlations that we've had over the last 4 or 5 years. And just like I said, I'm a data guy, right? So if I see that kind of stuff in the data, I'm just going to go with it. Lastly, we've got TPC Deer Run, the home of the John Deere Classic, another birdie fest with the bent POA greens. So very similar to Detroit Golf Club, and not a course that I had on this list last year, but one that I included after just really fishing around, trying to find a bent POA course that was easy, right? We had Detroit Golf Club, John Deere Classic. At least at first, it didn't come up as like a comp course for me. I was like, what's a Midwestern golf course that's super easy? But TPC Deer Run, hear me out on it, right? It's not the same off the tee. You do have trees at TPC Deer Run, right? Silvis, Illinois, a whole lot different than Napa Valley, California, but a similar type of skill set, right? It's an easy birdie fest, right? It's all about really keeping yourself in play off the tee and then going out there and making some 15 to 20 foot putts. So when you look at some of the crossover success, there's a little bit there, right? Maybe not as much as what we have with the Rocket Mortgage and the Travelers Championship, but just enough for me to consider it here on the comp course list. So I'll say that the comps this week, maybe not as strong as what we have for some tracks out there on the PGA Tour, but still worth taking a look at, especially when you have such a weak field, right? It's not like we're dealing with the world's best players. We kind of have an idea of where they succeed. We're going to have to do some digging this week, especially on some of the newer faces to the tour or some of the guys that we don't see quite as often. And by looking at also, right, especially with the Rocket Mortgage and John Deere Classic, also relatively weak field events, you might find a lot of their faces in those fields, which will help us out for our analysis with the lack of information this week. Alrighty guys, that is all we've got for the first course breakdown of this year. I am stoked for this week, super excited to be back to some DFS analysis too. So keep an eye out for all my content throughout the week. A little bit of a different schedule now that we've got football going on, right? I have a Monday Night Football preview already out here on the channel. So tomorrow will be when you see those core plays, right? Typically out here on a Monday, but we're going to delay that till tomorrow morning because of all the different Monday Night Football obligations that I have for tonight, right? Projections going up on Patreon, content that I already put out. Got to answer questions over there in Discord. You guys know the deal, right? It's a hectic time of the year, so schedule going to look a little bit different, right, than it was just golf out here, but all the same kind of content. We'll have core plays, value plays dropping there before the slate. No fades and sleepers, but we will be touching on those during our live stream on Wednesdays. So still going to have the live stream, still going to have core plays and value plays, and of course all the different showdown and prop content throughout the weekend too. So stoked for it. Check out the Patreon if you haven't already. Of course, going to have projections up over there and our props and all the different content for NFL as well. So I appreciate you guys. Hit that like button on the way out of here. Also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And let's have ourselves a week here at the Fortinet Championship.